We're in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Community and Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Anj Handa. She is the founder of Inspiring Women Changemakers and creator of Igniting Inspiration Awards. Anj, thank you so much for being on our interview series. If you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Hi, Christina. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me on. And hello, listeners. My name is Anj Handa. I identify as she, her. Those are my pronouns. I'm the founder of Inspiring Women Changemakers, which is a community of changemakers of all genders who stand for fairness and safety for women. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And as for what I wanted to be when I grew up, there were two things really. I wanted to be cabin crew and I also wanted to be a lawyer. The first one because I love travel and I love languages, and the second one because I've always stood for fairness and justice. Ever since I was a child, I had a very strong sense of self. Um, I've introduced aspects of both of those things throughout my work, and I'm sure we'll touch on them as we go on, because I've certainly travelled extensively around Europe, the States, Africa, and Asia. And in terms of my campaigning and my work around employment law, I cover off the lawyer bit as well.
Absolutely. So you incorporated both of those into your career, and you fast forward to now, you founded Inspiring Women Changemakers. And I do want to touch on the why and how do you think your personal journey really led you up until this point to have a strong sense of self as a child? I love that.
There are a few touch points, if you like, for my journey. So we'll come on to the key thing that led me to change my life in quite significant ways, and that was the suicide of a second friend of mine, which caused me to reevaluate everything that I did, I stood for, and what I wanted to see in my own life. I think it's quite significant that it's Suicide Prevention Week at the moment, so I'm mentioning that here. But my second friend's death brought up a lot of things for me, and what I wanted to see was more flow, but more purpose in my own life. So what was it that kept me awake at night? What were the things that I felt were unfair, but also what were the things that brought me fulfillment in terms of my work? And in the course of this personal development, I came across a tool called Ikigai. It's a Japanese tool. There are numerous books out there which you can purchase if you're interested. And essentially, it's the intersection between what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you could be paid for, as presented in this book. And my intersection was around women and girls, but most significantly, it was around female genital mutilation. And again, that is not something that is in my culture as a British Indian woman. It's not something that is widely practiced in India. But I'd read about it when I was around 20 or so, living in London, and I'd read a book by Waris Duree called Desert Flower.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Waris Duree is the UN ambassador on FGM. She was a top model. She was also a James Bond actress. And what she'd written in her autobiography must have planted some seed in me. She was talking about her child marriage, forced marriage, FGM, and these were all subjects that clearly affected me, but at the time I wasn't ready to do anything about it. So once I'd fast forwarded 15 odd years later and did this exercise on Ikigai, I thought, well, this is something, what do I want to do? And it coincided through synchronicity with a UK documentary called The Cruel Cut about the subject. On there were two high-profile activists leading the programme and a barrister named Felicity Gerry, who is Australia-based, but she's from the UK, and she's a leading global human rights barrister. So I followed them, but I'd also told my friends about this documentary, and one of those friends introduced me to a lady called Afuzat Saliu, on whose behalf I led a global legal and media campaign. I met her. She needed support with her immigration claim, with her asylum claim here in the UK. And that quickly started to snowball. And so I reached out on Twitter to Felicity, this human rights lawyer, who took the case on board. And I'm not doing a keynote, so I can't go into all of the details, unfortunately. But needless to say, because of her profile, and her reputation, various other lawyers got involved. And so I pulled together a pro bono team of top lawyers from Brussels, from around the UK, and her from Australia to help build the case on behalf of Afazat and her two daughters, claiming asylum on the risk of FGM on the two daughters if they were returned to Nigeria. That Change.org petition ultimately received 126,500 supporters. It also received attention from politicians, and even personalities like Richard Branson got involved. So that was a lot. And I often say that if someone had told me what it would have involved at the outset, I probably wouldn't have done it, because we all look around for the next capable person. Turns out in that case it was me. She was unfortunately deported, but quickly rallying the supporters of the Change.org campaign, we were able to raise funds to house the family and school the girls, because it was 2014, the time of the Boko Haram kidnapping of schoolgirls. And because of the profile of the case, and because they were quite easily identifiable, having British accents in Lagos, we were keen to keep them safe. And so the rest of those funds were used to support other grassroots organisations in the UK doing that work around FGM. It then led to a report which I worked on with the local authorities and the health authorities. And so a year later, when I finally had some time to reflect, I thought about what worked, what worked with this. And so now I'm coming on to answer your question about how it led to inspiring women changemakers. It was the professional, wholehearted people that brought their skills along. It was attracting individuals from all parts of society, and I'm talking about global society here. So retired Englishmen feeling some sense of purpose themselves. Maybe they were grandfathers and wanted to put their skills to use, so we're offering support with research or social media sharing, with young African students, male students from Kenya and further afield, also the types of people that in my everyday life I wouldn't come across. And I think in terms of my own skills, I was already trained in political lobbying, so I knew how to navigate those corridors of power. I was trained in media relations, I was trained in public speaking and board level reports and writing. So those were some skills and advantages that I had in leading my campaign. And I thought, a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, don't necessarily have those skills and don't really know where to start when it comes to networking for social change and building up those partnerships. And that's how Inspiring Women Changemakers was born. Essentially, it was, how do I help others like me to have the connections, the skills, and the launch pad to make social change?
That's incredible. I mean, it sounds like a really intentional journey that you're passionate about. Again, fairness and, for women is really important. And it sounds like you've also been an advocate for others to get involved in this work as well. If we think about kind of the workplace as well, how do you kind of think about measuring this psychological safety, specifically for like women identifying folks when they are in the workplace?
I don't think there's a straight answer, really. It's a gut feeling, if
Mhm.
anything. I do find that the culture of an organization is tangible. You almost get a feeling when you walk through into the lobby. So you have this gut feeling when you walk into the reception of an organization. And okay, a lot of us have been online primarily for the last 18 months, but even on Zoom you get a feel for how people are engaging with you, how you're welcomed, how they're speaking, and that ripples out to workplace behaviors as well. So what might be classed as banter in one sector, let's say the media sector or a sector that I worked in, IT recruitment, IT headhunting. It was very male dominated, older male clients and contractors that I represented. And at the time I was much younger, I was in my early 20s. And what I accepted even then, so it's also a life journey issue, what I accepted or bantered back on, if you like, at that time would not be acceptable to me now. And so for me, it's how our organizations and managers really making sure that they are dealing with complaints effectively, that there is a feedback mechanism, that they're taking action in an appropriate manner through their in line with their policies and processes, and that people feel safe to actually say in the first place that they're uncomfortable or this has happened to them. Because me being in my mid-40s now, it's very different, as I say, to how I was before, and the level of confidence and ability to speak my own truth is greater than them. So how are we supporting people coming up in the workplace as well at different levels?
Yeah, I think that is definitely really important. And it is a gut feeling in terms of if you feel included in the environment, if you feel discriminated against. And I think part of that also in terms of building trust and like giving and receiving feedback around that gut feeling is really important. And it's an ongoing process. One of the topics also that you kind of discuss as well is kind of this thought around emotional correctness. Can you define what that means for folks?
Yeah, so emotional correctness is above and beyond civility. When we think about being civil, it's just about being polite. Emotional correctness is more than that. And there's an excellent TED talk by a lady called Sally Cohn who talks about being emotionally correct even when you believe somebody is politically wrong. And that worked for me genuinely and still continues to work, and not only in my campaigning, but when I'm facilitating difficult conversations on behalf of my clients. And what it really means is taking responsibilities for your words and your actions, and recognizing that we each have inner power. So it's not necessarily linked to status in the workplace or anything like that. It's more about what are our boundaries and parameters, and we'll come on to that next, I think. But what are we willing to put up with or not, and how do we set and maintain those healthy boundaries and speak from that place of integrity, that this is just not okay. If you're witnessing it in other people misbehaving, how do we call that out without blaming and shaming? Because that shuts down conversations. Whereas if we say that that's not okay, and let's look at it this way, let's do this, let's try this, but also role modeling that behavior and recognizing that when we're dealing with human beings, we've all got our own different inner dialogue going on. And that is the challenge around all of this work, right? Because it varies within each of us in any given minute, second, hour, week of the day. So how are we responsible? How do we pick up on people's non-verbal cues as well, and being emotionally correct in that way of just seeking to actively listen rather than to speak and be right?
Exactly. I think active listening is really important, especially for hard conversations and everybody having their perspective. I think of Brene Brown and the story I'm telling myself versus the story that's actually happening in my head. And let's touch on healthy boundaries. I'm a big fan of setting those and creating those and communicating them. What does it really look like in practice to set these healthy boundaries, specifically at work, too?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned Brené Brown, because I also love Brené Brown's work. And when it comes to boundaries, Brené talks about clear is kind, unclear is unkind. I think that's such a simple way of describing it. So when it comes to managers, being clear about their expectations, not constantly demanding more, doing that. If something else is required, setting that out in writing, in a meeting, mutual agreement. With individuals, not thinking that you've got to overwork. So presenteeism, especially as people are returning to offices, and that's happening at different speeds according to where you live in the world. But this notion of I must be there at this time. And that's changed. People's health and expectations, having worked from home for a period, has changed the workplace culture. And I do believe that employers need to be switched onto that. So what are we asking of people? Is it reasonable? But likewise, as an employee, is what you're asking of your employer reasonable as well? How do you meet in the middle? What's a reasonable request for adjustments? Healthy boundaries, to me, also, I talked about inner power. It's also about not engaging in office politics or gossip. Because again, if you're saying things and engaging in that gossip, what are people thinking you're saying about them?
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
again, that be clear, be clear, have integrity. Don't back chat about your employed. That go straight with your requests and ask for clarification. But also in the workplace sense, to avoid jargon. What I find with when people move to a new sector or a new employer, they have to learn the jargon of that
Yeah.
employer again. So all the acronyms that are used, or because jargon can be inclusive in the sense it's a shortcut for anyone who's in the know, but it can also be very excluding in that people feel that they don't want to ask what something means because they might look silly, or they should know that, when really there's no reason why they should. So those for me are some examples of boundaries in the workplace.
I think those are good examples. And one of the things you mentioned too, in terms of modeling that behavior, again, positionality as well, in terms of your career and people managers, I think is really important to that strategy of setting and creating healthy boundaries. And I want to ask your opinion in terms of operationalizing inclusive people management into performance reviews, what that looks like in terms of KPIs, and how we should be measuring that effective leadership as well.
Sure. So, in terms of the operational KPIs, some very practical suggestions, some measures could be at a whole organization level or even a departmental level, segmentation. So, thinking about the diverse characteristics that you want to measure, whether it's race, gender, or age, disability, or a couple of those, just start with one or two is what I always suggest, because I see organizations try to measure the whole thing and they don't do it right. Rather start and then roll out your approach. How many people are holding those characteristics at different levels within the organizations? So I'm thinking here about shop floor, supervisory, mid-management, C-suite. It's all very well to have great diversity across all the characteristics at a junior level, but if there is no representation at board level, then something is going wrong, and you can't identify the barriers to progression, which usually occur around mid-management level anyway, unless you're measuring that. And some of that will be qualitative measures, so you might be looking at various data around recruitment, retention, turnover. What are the responses you get from exit interviews, for example? But also, what do your absence stats look like? And are there patterns with that? So, for example, when I've delivered mental health in the workplace training for line managers, organizations haven't thought about making the connection between people signing off for regular short periods um, based on backache, headache, migraine, when really the issue is stress, which may or may not be linked to mental health in the workplace. So, trying to identify those patterns through using the data in the right way. And also using, as I said, the qualitative feedback. So the kind of feedback loops that AllVoices offers is super useful, that anonymity, but also how are you recording the conversations in performance reviews, the regular ones and the informal meetings? How are you building up a big picture around your company culture, and whether people not just come, but whether they stay and flourish within your organization?
Exactly. I think an insights driven approach is really important, both the qualitative and quantitative data of how people are feeling, looking at the stats, looking at the foundation of your company and seeing kind of where you can go from there, and prioritizing kind of where to go to. If everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So really being honest there. And you mentioned not only kind of bringing in, underrepresented talent, but also retention as well. I wanted to ask your opinion too, in terms of, is there anything you're seeing organizations forget to do or common mistakes in their retention strategy and in the time and place we're in for work?
Well, there's something else we didn't talk about when it comes to data, which is benchmarking. So it's not just an internal process, but benchmarking against your sector or your competitors. How are you doing there? One straightforward example I have is I used to run a cross-sector group called the Diversity Forum, and we had the likes of an offshoot of HSBC Bank, which is called First Direct. And then we had the fire and rescue service, we had police, we had voluntary and community sector organisations. So that was not like with like when it came to benchmarking. So we chose two characteristics that we wanted to focus on, and it was a longer period. So it was a 3-year process that members of the Diversity Forum opted in on, but we had to do the qualitative measurement because having one extra woman identifying member of staff within a call centre was definitely not the same as a female fire, a woman identifying firefighter. That took a lot of work, various efforts around recruitment. And the other thing around recruitment as well is, are your processes or your adverts in the first place causing people to deselect themselves? And there are many tools out there where you can check your language, so you can make sure whether the language is attractive or gender neutral, for example, and how you craft those, but also in terms of qualifications or continuous work experience. If you've had time out for whatever reason, whether it was for health, maternity or otherwise, again, you're preventing talent from joining you by putting the wrong criteria in your adverts.
I think inclusive language, inclusive design is really important. And again, that intentionality piece, it's a full picture as well, from the job description to onboarding to performance reviews and to how you're speaking at the company overall. And I think that is something that should be invested in as well. I do want to kind of ask your opinion around building that trust, building that culture of feedback, because it doesn't just happen overnight. And some folks are a little weary of receiving that feedback, especially in an anonymous way as well, or whatever platform to, because then they have to action on it and then they have to respond to it as well, which we definitely believe in two-way communication. But how do you see an employee feedback management platform really impacting the culture of a workplace, whether you're hybrid, in person, or virtual first?
It can be tiring, but nobody said this was easy. I think that's the first thing. It's not easy, and it's ongoing, and it's continual effort, but it is worth it. So that's the first thing I want to say. And there are various approaches, and again, it depends on size, geography, all sorts of different factors, because again, we're not comparing, if we're thinking about a large bank compared to a small chain of stores, it's not the same approach. So it has to be reasonable and proportionate for the organization. But some things could be offering really truly genuine mentoring opportunities. So finding the right match for people. I remember when I was at the start of my career being mentored with people that just couldn't get me. So thinking about who's going to mentor whom and how, and if you're doing reverse mentoring, how is that going to work? Is there the appetite? Is there the openness for something like that? Looking at personal development and progression opportunities at all levels as well. I talked earlier about from shop floor through to C-suite. Are we giving the people the right opportunities to move through, should they choose to? Maybe they don't choose to as well, because we're all individuals. Ensuring that voices are heard and the feedback's acted upon. So even though AllVoices provides that anonymized feedback, even so, there can be a communication strategy around, you said, so we did, or you said, we haven't done this because, and so really explaining why certain things aren't moving at a pace that employees maybe want. Again, coming back to what we discussed right at the start, is it reasonable? What are expectations? What is possible? And making other adjustments around the practical things like start and end times, accessibility needs, equipment, all of those kind of things.
Yeah, all of it plays into the overall strategy. Accessibility is definitely really important. And we're talking about meeting employees where they are, recognizing that a personalized experience is important. And then again, effective
Yeah.
communication, clear is the best way to go here as well. What is your kind of research shown in terms of if people don't have this kind of employee listening strategy, they don't have these touch point, does that mean that everybody is happy at the company and there's absolutely no feedback?
Oh, of course not, because we know that people talk. They talk about water cooler moments. There are downsides to that as well. People are talking whether you like it or not. That not just within the workplace, but within their communities, on social media. You may not see that as an organization, but you can bet that it will be impacting the people that are applying for your organization or not, and how people are going. And also not to underestimate the ripple effect of demotivation. So if somebody there in a team feels bullied or harassed and it hasn't been dealt with effectively, how does that make their team members feel as well?
Mm-hmm. I think it does have a rippling effect as well.
Mm.
People are talking all the time, whether it's on Slack, social media, like you said, or in person as well, and not just with their team members, but with their community and with their friends and with their family. So it does have an effect on folks. I also wanted to ask in terms of just sayings that we have incorporated into our kind of daily life in terms of work. Do you believe in the saying, in order to do great work, you need to really love what you do and have a passion for it?
Personally, I do. Sometimes people just need to pay the bills. Um, but for me, absolutely, I have to love what I do. But not only that, I would go further. I would say I want to add value and be valued.
I think a lot of people want to be valued and have their work really make an impact on the organization as well. And I do like the caveat. Sometimes people do just want to pay the bills, but also some people want to be like really emotionally attached to the work that they're doing and the mission. And it's different for everyone. So how do you really practice self-care in this work that is sometimes a lot of emotional labor and you're passionate about it, so you want to work on it? A lot of the time it doesn't feel like work, but how do you kind of care for yourself?
I have self boundaries. We talked about boundaries before. So, what that looks like for me is I, beyond these times, I'm not working. At weekends, it is an exception if I work, that I have time for my overall well being, whether that's walking, painting, cooking, gardening, all of those are things that I love. I'm highly creative. That looks different for everybody as well. But making sure that I have the time for the things that I want to do, whether that's spending time with family and friends, having solo time, even if it just means sitting in the armchair and
Yeah.
doing nothing at all. Um, and being kind to yourself in that way. I always say that self-care isn't necessarily bubble baths. It's about setting and keeping healthy boundaries and making sure that you do stick to them.
Absolutely. Sometimes it is about the bubble bath and the face mask, but most of the time it's about investing in time with yourself and seeing kind of what you need as well and doing that internal work with a capital W. And is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share with our audience, or maybe 1 to 2 key insights you hope that listeners bring with them after they listen to our conversation today?
I think we've covered a lot in a very short space of time. But
Yeah.
for me, that we've talked about some very tangible things like KPIs and what have you. But um, the work with the capital W is the inner work. If we truly want to create inclusive workplaces, inclusive communities, inclusive um, social circles, the work starts with us ourselves to be as compassionate as we can be to ourselves and to others.
Absolutely. I think you need to show yourself some grace, show others grace, and also do the internal work as well to have these hard conversations and also act upon creating an equitable and inclusive environment all of the time. Anj, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Christina.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices, it believes in employee feedback management, and we know it's a requirement for a company to really be successful. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.